we got would arguably be one of the biggest briefs of anybody's career at the time. And it was, hey, the invasion is happening. In February of 22, as has been previously reported, all of the red balloons were up. We knew that it was going down. The reason why I remember that date of this brief is because it's tied to the UAP experience.
The group that you guys are responsible for is invading another country, right?
This is a Super Bowl that we never imagined would ever be a Super Bowl, as I'm sure you have experienced. No fighter pilot wants to sit on the boat. No person in our shoes wants to be back home. And so it was a wild time.
Caison Best, everyone. Welcome back to the Safe Aerospace podcast. Thanks for joining. Joined today by Caison Best, a friend, colleague in the UAP space, a veteran like myself. He has his own UAP experience that we'll talk about here in a minute. But he's also been someone that has not just been a witness, but has gone through the reporting process starting what year? When did we first report to AARO?
Oh my gosh. I think I was just getting out, so it must have been 2023.
2023, report to AARO, report to the FBI, and eventually joined Americans for Safe Aerospace as our intake lead with our reports. And I'm sure some of our listeners will recognize your name and potentially voice. And hopefully they have good things to report. But Caison did a fantastic job bringing in and managing a lot of the workflow, and I had to, start focusing on some other activities.
Well, thank you. That's the first compliment I've gotten from you. So,
and before I turn the ball over to you, today is the 13th of June. It's a Saturday. Yesterday, the DoD released their third tranche of UAP reports, and as we've been perusing that here at Safe Aerospace, a number of those reports are reports that we received first and ultimately, with the witnesses' permission, brought forward to various groups, including the FBI, and you were responsible for doing that for some of the cases. So you've been involved in this for quite some time. So it's great to finally actually sit down and talk to you on camera. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I think I've been very lucky in life to have a lot of heroes along the way, and you are one of them. And so it's cool to call you a friend as well. And thanks for rolling the red carpet out for me today. It was a blast. Yeah. I'm excited for after this as well. So
yes, I am trying to motivate him to move down to Austin so we can continue to work together. So we'll see if this whole ploy works. So let's start early on. Let's talk about your military service, kind of let people understand what you did.
Yeah. I'll share a little bit. I think maybe some of my prior life decisions will make a little more sense just with some of my background. I grew up in a very nice family playing high-level tennis as a kid in Middle Tennessee. So I had a good gig going and lived by myself in South Florida for a couple of years in the end of high school. And I'll share that because it gets into how I made kind of like the first big split in my life. And I was just looking for purpose. The military is not on my radar whatsoever. I didn't know what West Point was. I had heard the name, and I'd also seen the movie Major Payne. And I figured
right up there with Top Gun.
Unfortunately,
for recruitment purposes,
agree.
I suppose. Yeah,
it may be. And I thought West Point was like a school for delinquent kids, where like troubled kids get sent by their families. And that might be true to some degree.
As it turns out.
Yeah. But I had no clue what it was. But I guess through a lot of serendipity, looking for some purpose in my life, like many young men are at that time, the Army sounded like a sweet gig. So jumped with both feet and kind of got onto the track to where we are today. Crazy enough.
Awesome. What did you study at West Point?
So I was a human geography major.
Human geography.
Yeah. It's an engineering school, believe it or not. But there's a couple of the softer majors there as well.
Well, there's a spectrum at the academies that come out.
Well, yeah.
Especially special operations and pilots. I think everyone has an image of what their educational background is, but you get everything from people with masters in physics to people with degrees in shipbuilding to the proverbial basket weaving and everything in between. At the end of the day, to do those types of job require the type of education you're getting at a school isn't necessarily preparing you for a standard career, right? And the type of skill sets that you need go far beyond what you do in the classroom in order to be able to execute those jobs. That's my take on it anyway.
No, I think that's a good one. I did it because I was on a sports team, and that takes a lot of work. I wanted to have a high enough class rank to where I could pick whatever I wanted to do in the real Army, and I was interested in it. And I figured like those are three good enough reasons to justify not actually learning a hard skill such as engineering or mathematics or physics. And I think it's worked out. It actually helped a lot in my career, to your point, in ways that I would not have expected it to.
We still ultimately ended up at MIT, but we'll get to that in a moment. What happened with that Army career? Let's kind of get into that. Where'd you end up?
So I went all in when I went to West Point. I actually wanted to be a fighter pilot at the Air Force Academy. The only reason I got into school is because of tennis. I did not have the background worthy of going to West Point, frankly, otherwise, academically at least. At the same time, the Air Force Academy coach was trying to recruit me to play tennis there, and he made a huge mistake by telling me that I was too tall to be a fighter pilot. And, you know, being a 17-year-old kid, I was like, hey, this guy's been at the academy for 15 years. He must know what he's talking about. But little did he know, once I heard that you couldn't be strapping yourself to a rocket ship, I was out. And so I pivoted to, okay, well, the hardest thing to be off the ground is a fighter pilot, from my understanding. I might as well just be the hardest thing I can be on the ground. And so that was kind of like my driving arrow that kind of got me to what I was doing. So I started off as a airborne infantry officer in the 82nd Airborne. After a year of training at Fort Benning, doing just the standard pipeline for an infantry officer. So airborne school, infantry officer school, ranger school, rappelling out of helicopters, and then getting shipped off to Fort Bragg.
All the fun stuff.
Yeah. It was fun.
I bet. What's at Fort Bragg?
The best way to describe Bragg that people say is, you know, kind of the epicenter for the Army. It's a black hole for airborne special operations and what I would argue is kind of the most competent components for those on the ground. Okay. To include JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, to include colloquially Delta Force, to include Special Operations Command for the Army, so USASOC, and then the 82nd Airborne, which, you know, we were a little bit more regular, but we were right there, and it was a cool spot to be.
Very cool. And that was what, like a 3-year, 4-year duty there?
Yeah, so it was my junior officer time before captain. So it ended up being about 3 years plus the year of training.
Yeah. Well, take us through it. So that's considered a special operations assignment?
No.
No?
So the 82nd would not be. It's just 18th Airborne Corps, regular Army, loosely affiliated with the special operations world, pretty much just because of proximity.
I see.
You know, I would say it's the best of the conventional forces.
Okay.
Yeah. And people will say that I'm biased, which is completely fair, but I think that's a fair statement.
Okay. Very good. So you did that for a few years, and then did you deploy at all during that?
Yeah. Again, through just extreme serendipity, my brigade in the Army was the only infantry brigade that was slated to go to Afghanistan in 2019. So for a little bit of context, the war, the writing on the wall was very apparent. Administrations were trying to get out. Obviously, a historically difficult event to do. And so we were on the tail end. And then in my brigade of 3 battalions, my battalion, so my unit that I'm intimately with day to day, was selected to be the only combat battalion in Afghanistan, aside from the Special Forces battalion that we were attached with. So the role was called AI, Attached Infantry. Really what we did was we were the ones with the machine guns and kind of doing the grunt work, attached to Army Special Forces, who their mission was much more with like controlling partner forces, dealing with Afghan special operations, trying to get them to fight while we were kind of pulling the security and, you know, doing more basic infantry tasks.
Got it. Any firefights out there, or was it too wound down?
Yeah. So again, just completely through luck, I found myself the executive officer for the Special Operations Task Force tied to the ISIS mission. So it was called SOTF 20.3. I was the XO for the attached infantry, and then worked directly alongside an XO for the Special Forces company that was in charge in Nangarhar province. So the best way to think of it was a completely separate battle away from the Taliban, partnered with the Taliban. which is pretty interesting, but like classic special operations. So we were partnering with the Taliban, providing the Air Force as they swept through Nangarhar Valley doing the harder work, and we stopped ISIS from receding into Jalalabad, which was the major population center.
It's amazing how fast, foes become allies.
It's crazy. I mean, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that was exactly the case. So in the entire country, we're fighting Taliban and Taliban only, and then in Achin and Dabala district in Nangarhar province, we are partnered with them.
Wild.
And a world that I honestly didn't know anything about. I'm just an infantry dude. We don't have clearances really. We go on missions and we don't really even know like what we're there to, like who we're there to capture.
Yeah.
I come to find out later that it's really nobody that important, but you're really left in the dark. Yeah. But yes, to answer your question, firefights, living on a combat outpost with 60 other guys and that's it. Showers every 2 weeks, the full experience.
Yeah, the full experience. That's the right way to say it. Did you get a nice vacation after that, or what came next?
COVID came next. Yeah, so the ISIS mission dried up in October of 19. I did a stint at the Special Operations Headquarters in Bagram, doing kind of more staff work, not combat stuff. Got shipped home, and then the day that we showed up to Fort Bragg on Pope Army Airfield, we got told there's a thing called COVID and you're quarantining. So we did not pass go. We did not get to see our families that were waiting for us after a 10-month combat deployment.
Brutal.
And we went straight into tents in the woods.
Brutal.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine.
There were,
I can't even
upset
imagine.
was not a word to describe it.
I mean, that's bad. It's like, you probably could call your wife. Everyone has to call their spouses and explain that, cancel the party, I'm being quarantined for an unknown amount of time.
They were lined up at the fence at the airfield when we got off the plane, and they could not see us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was a rough moment.
I bet.
But to answer your question on the vacation part, no, the vacation was quarantine, unfortunately.
Yeah. And all right, well, keep us going. Where were you next?
Some of the work that I did in Afghanistan in that staff role, I was the future operations officer for the Special Operations Task Force. So I was a senior lieutenant in my battalion. The SOTF, that task force, needed a officer. Normally it'd be a Green Beret, a Special Forces guy. They were short at the time because of staffing. And so they kind of pulled up the most senior person who was unemployed. And I was unemployed because the battle was over against ISIS, at least on paper. And so I found myself into a world there that was much more compartmentalized. You literally go into a building or a compound within a compound within a compound that was Camp Alpha, the special operations interagency camp on Bagram. And you walk past a fence many times going to the chow hall, just back and forth for a week as paperwork goes through and you're waiting to get your read-ons. And then one day they say, hey, you're good to go. And then you go into a door that you walk past that you never noticed because it was just an indiscreet door, and there's Christmas lights on the other side. And it's a little bit different of an atmosphere, and you get read on to the information that you need to know to understand what's actually going on in the country. And that was a very different departure from being in combat, not knowing why you're in combat, to not in combat and knowing what's actually going on.
Funny how that works, huh?
Crazy. Like it's truly like going down the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. The reason why I shared that is that made me recognize that there was a lot more going on, where previously I was kind of worshiping the combat roles.
Yeah. Didn't know how much was behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'm a person who is fascinated by trying to tether myself to reality as much as I can. And it definitely sparked an interest. And that led me to, I would say serendipity, but I don't think that's the right word. I think there were other forces involved to getting me into a role as an intelligence officer, Intense Special Forces Group, which was a job that 100 other people applied for. And for some reason I got it. And so I made a completely different shift. Yeah, completely different career change.
So out of combat into that darker world. Yeah.
And the intelligence world is a beast, and it's not a monolith, and it's extraordinarily bloated, like all of the government is to some degree, right? Any bureaucracy. but there's components of it that do some extremely interesting things at extremely high levels. And I was lucky enough to find myself in that world. And I think lucky's honestly kind of the phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you share any of the circumstances, or is it worth sharing?
Circumstances with
getting that one slot?
I think it's just more of along the lines of like they're looking for certain people, and certain people have identified who they're looking for, and that's kind of how the world
holes
works.
of the Swiss cheese lined up enough. Yeah,
it's like kind of how the world works anyway. It's
Yeah.
like somebody knows somebody who needs something, and they might know a guy, I guess.
Yeah. And where were you located during this? This was at Bagram?
That's all at Fort Bragg.
Oh, Fort Bragg. Okay.
Like when I was out processing from infantry to intelligence, that process started.
And did you stay there, or did you go off to like a new duty station?
Yeah, so I had to do a year. So I did a year for infantry training. Now I have to do a year for intelligence training. I went to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Sierra Vista, right on the Mexican border. Cool place. I enjoyed it. Much nerdier. So much nerdier than the world that I, exited.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm sure. Yeah, different. Vibe,
so it was
sure.
a complete culture shock. Here's a guy with a master infantry badge, a ranger tab. Sorry, good lord, don't make that mistake. And a chip on my shoulder, and now I'm in the Army Center of Excellence for Intelligence. So it was
people straight out of school in some cases.
I'm glad, and I'm glad it took we were there for a year, because that gave me room to like reorient myself.
yeah, decompress a little bit, and then where to?
Straight to 10th Special Forces Group.
Yeah,
Fort Carson, Colorado. Yeah, and it was a weird time because we're getting out of Afghanistan. This is 2021 now.
Okay.
We're getting out of Afghanistan. We're completely pivoting to near peer adversaries. And then just like that, I show up and, the Russia-Ukraine conflict happens. And 10 Special Forces Group, again, serendipity, is the organization in the Army that deals with Russian aggression. So very busy.
I will say this, I've talked to a lot of people who have told me they've joined the military to fly, and for whatever reason, or had the intention to, right, or got the bug, and didn't work out, but got to do some pretty amazing stuff that makes me very jealous. So, I think you had a pretty wild career.
Hey, I'm jealous of you, so it's mutual.
That brings us to a great point in the conversation where we run into your UAP encounter. Do we not?
Here we are.
Time to get into that.
Well executed. Where would you like to start?
Well, where are we, and what are you doing, and where you're going, and what do you see?
Yeah, brilliant. So this is chronological and kind of the very next step in the story that I was just sharing. So in February of 22, we had been obviously monitoring the buildup in or around Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia. In the intelligence world, you go off of indicators. And in February of 22, as has been previously reported, all of the red balloons were up. We knew that it was going down. On February 15th, and the reason why I remember that date of this brief is because it's tied to the UAP experience. We got what would arguably be, one of the biggest briefs of anybody's career at the time. And it was, hey, the invasion is happening.
The group that you guys are responsible for is invading another country, right? Not just like it's a big global event,
this is our Super Bowl.
This is your, exactly.
This is our Super Bowl. This is a Super Bowl that we never imagined would ever be a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And yes, and in a world of extraordinarily high testosterone people who want to be doing their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I'm sure you have experienced.
Yeah.
No fighter pilot wants to sit on the boat. No person in our shoes wants to be back home.
Yeah.
And so it was a wild time. And I just kind of share that to stress the importance of this brief. And this brief was, hey, this is going down. I can kind of feel it, honestly, like the energy of just even reminiscing back on it. And so on the 15th, I'm the commander of the intelligence detachment for a Special Forces battalion. So I have more than a few dozen people under my command, and we get the word. I work in a skiff for most of my job when we're in garrison and not training. And so I get the call that, hey, yourself, your second in command, and some of your best analysts go up to the group headquarters building at a certain time. I think it was 11. I think it's 11 in the morning. Yeah. If I remember correctly, it might've been 11:30, might've been 10:30, but it was late morning, go into the group skiff to get this update brief. So I get my second in command. I get two of my better GeoInt analysts, so imagery from satellites, and I get one of my all-source analysts. And he was like a jack of all trades intelligence guy. And, it's the best people we have in a group of more than a few dozen. And we go up to our group headquarters building, and it's like maybe a 7-8 minute walk. Our battalion headquarters is in a depression, so it's like noticeably below. And just to orient to Fort Carson, it's a major Army facility with a lot of training area, but to the west, directly to the west across the highway, is Cheyenne Mountain Space Force Base, which is pretty infamous for like the Doomsday Bunker, whatever goes on in there, NORAD, but it's also a major facility, but it's a base underground and under a mountain. Right?
Yep, it's often seen in movies, right? That's classic, concrete entrance to the side of a mountain.
Yeah. And we have nothing to do with them. But we're directly east of them, about 6 miles away, from the tip of the mountain to right where the center of our compound is. And the Special Forces compound is a major facility inside Fort Carson. So it's like a compound within a compound with like different colored roofs, different rules, different world. And so we're just walking from my headquarters to the main headquarters. And the first thing we have to do is get out of our parking lot and take a flight of, maybe 40, 50 steps up like the exit of a depression, kind of like I don't even know how you do, like an embankment.
A little embankment, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a hill because it's not 360, but it's just a flat embankment. Sure. And so all 5 of us are going up these stairs, pretty excited, thinking about what's going on in our job, in our career, and frankly, our life. And we get to the very top of these stairs, and just naturally in our field of view, it's there. It's like I'm looking at you. It's just naturally there. Cheyenne Mountain reveals itself as you're going up the stairs. And over the saddle of Cheyenne Mountain, a little bit to the right of where the crazy antenna array is, was an object that was, when you saw it, it was so shocking that it pretty much sent, I can speak for myself, sent me into like the amount of tunnel vision that was about the same level as like your first firefight, where you're just locked in because you're trying to process something that's so outside your reality that it just captivates your attention.
You're all looking at this.
I was looking at it, and we're in a little cluster. Yeah. It's 5 guys on probably 2 steps of stairs, and we're at the top now. And I'm looking at it. Somebody says, "What the fuck?" Somebody says, stuttering how I am a bit, like, "What is that?"
Clear to you that everyone's seeing what you're seeing right now.
Yeah. It's just there.
What? Let's describe it. What did it look like?
Like an Apple product thousands of years in the future.
Yeah.
Like how like a AirPod case is just kind of beautiful, like it's well machined, it's well engineered, it's good plastic, like the seams are tight, like it's like a pretty object, and it's like impressive, just even though it's an everyday thing for us. It was like that, but thousands of years more impressive. It was very large. Hard to describe the size, other than the proximity it had over the mountain. So we did have the mountain right there as kind of like a gauge, and it was pretty apparent that it was pretty much directly over the mountain. It was definitely not in front, and it was, I would say, almost certainly like not far behind. It was close enough to where you could see that it was 3-dimensional, like a ellipsoidal, kind of like a blimp, and you could see the bottom. Like you could see that it wasn't just a sticker. It wasn't just 2-dimensional or anything like that. Instantly, I was processing why it was just perfectly still. And like, that's a weird thing to say, because like this table is still, like there's many things in our lives that the microphone's still. It was like still beyond a level of still that I'd ever seen. As far as like it just being fixed in a point in like, not even the sky, but like dimensionality or something. Like,
You just, it's right on the XYZ,
yeah,
scale. It's fixed,
fixed, except the body of the object itself, which, I hate to throw out a number, but it was hundreds of feet in width.
If you were, holding your arm out, like this, how big in your sight vision was it?
About half a thumb's length.
Half a thumb's length?
Yeah. 6 miles away.
Okay. And again, we don't know, we're making an assumption about how far it is based off of your perception of it being over the mountain. There's probably some buffer in there, but I'd have to do the math to see what actually works out to the size, right? For the range and all that good stuff, do a little trig. But, but that's something we could figure out and given, I think a pretty rough estimate of the size. But this is a pretty large object.
In relation to the mountain, it was probably a few thousand feet over it, but still like close enough to where you could tell where it was in relation to the mountain and the saddle that is Cheyenne. It was really large.
And you've described it in the past as almost peanut shaped or bean shaped, where there's almost an indentation on the bottom, or wasn't like perfectly flat, right?
I think the best way to describe it, and this thing is so hard to describe, and it's taken me years to honestly like have the vocabulary to give it kind of justice, because it was so far out there. It did not make, like, anything that I could have come up with would not have been that. No. But it was generally ellipsoidal. When I reported to AARO and I reported to the FBI, I said it was asymmetric, which is true, but it wasn't like fully lopsided or anything like that. It was more asymmetric in that, and this is a key feature, the whole thing was comprised of the same uniform panels. And the panels were, my best guess, all pentagonal, but were all irregular. They seemed like they all had like a similar area. Like they weren't different sizes and things like that, but they were different shaped. But they seemed like they were all pentagons, and they were just completely across the object. Like I don't see any reason to believe that it wasn't wrapped all the way around. I didn't see the backside, but like there was nothing to show that it wasn't just this uniform ellipsoid of panels.
So not like panels you'd see like tiling on a floor. Each one had like a different shape, but generally had 5 sides.
Right. So like if a floor, or if like the bottom of, a space shuttle or something like that is 2-dimensional, it had a texture, it had a pattern to it. And that was the thing that I think gave it the most, not perception because it was true, but like the most asymmetry.
And the texture was caused at the intersection of the panels,
exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, the texture was the field of panels themselves. They did not overlap like a fish scale or anything like that. They were all uniformly seamed, it seems like, at hinges. And it was just one of the most shocking things about it was just the pattern of them. It just did not make sense into my mind. Like, it looked miraculous that the pattern fit together in a way that it was all contained without overlap, but was still so irregular. And then even one more level, it was rippling. It wasn't just stationary as far as like, and 3-dimensional. It was like that 4th dimension of movement.
The panels themselves,
the panels themselves were rippling, almost like ripples in a pond, but were in a geometric way, because it wasn't, a pond ripple. It was
all across the vehicle, the object?
Slowly, casually, like not just like slowly rippling across from like disparate points.
Not a reflection though. It was clear that the panels are moving.
You could see the shadows like of the surface. I also said this when I reported it, like it gave it like a glint or a shimmer. And that kind of went a little too far, I think, with some of the representations to make it look like like crystalline or something. It wasn't that.
What color was it?
It was like kind of porcelain, definitely all white. So like no brown in it or anything. Like it was white porcelain, but that was kind of like creamy and translucently. Almost like I think the best explanation is if you have like really watery milk, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It was kind of like that. It was like really watery milk with like a little bit of a shimmer that was kind of similar to mother of pearl, but not like extreme in the rainbow effects or anything. Just like a little
Sure, it seemed to shimmer a bit, but no, it wasn't outputting any visible light, best you could tell, perhaps reflecting any, or?
It was reflecting for sure to some degree, because Just to get, I guess, into the weather of the day, it was just one of those classic, perfect Bluebird Colorado Springs days, especially in the winter. You know, in the springs, it'll go from snowing one day to 2 days later, it's 50 degrees, most beautiful blue sky, only the sun out. It was one of those days, not a cloud in the sky. So it was plenty sunny and it was pretty close to midday. And so there definitely was a glint, but it wasn't like it's going to, refract into your eye and like stun you kind of glint. It was just an object interacting with the sun's rays.
Could you tell if there was a forward or aft direction to it?
What do you mean?
Like what, you see an aircraft, you know where the front is or the back, right? Was there any sense of that?
A potato's not the right word and a blimp's not the right word either, but like kind of just a ellipsoid in the sky. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, great description. Thank you. I mean, what happened next? I mean, you're all looking at it. You're hearing your friends next to you. Well, what's going through? What happens here?
So I do not have a confident gauge on time, just because we were locked in, and I think almost everybody has had an experience where they're tunnel visioned, whether it's almost getting in a car wreck or whatever. Like your perception of time is extremely diluted, and that was the case. I mean, it had my attention. But enough time elapsed to where like a terse conversation occurred between us of like, do you see that? Yeah, I see that. What the fuck is that? Stuttering. Like time elapsed enough for that. I don't know, honestly, if it's 10 seconds or if it's 3 minutes. But I think it's probably in that range. And I know it's a big range, but again. And this is the part that like is so unsatisfying. And it was unsatisfying as soon as it happened. I can only speak for myself and what other people said at the time. But from what I saw, we were on a hill in a pretty open fort which is on a hill where you can see like practically to Kansas to the east, Colorado Springs to the north, nothing to the south, and Cheyenne Mountain directly to us to the west. So you can see everywhere. And our eyes are pretty locked onto this onto the target. Maybe we had glanced to each other for like a terse word, but I was looking at it and it was there and then it wasn't.
Just blinked out.
I didn't even see it blink out. Yeah, I wish I had seen it do something because there would have been like some closure. It's like a firefight when like it doesn't have a conclusion. It's like the worst feeling in the world. Like you want a conclusion even if it's not good. It was kind of like that where it just was no longer there. I can say in enough hindsight, whatever the time was that for it to be there and then no longer there, it must have been almost as fast, if not faster than like our shutter speed for like our perception or something. It was just not there.
It didn't fade away. It didn't shoot off.
It didn't fizzle. It didn't dissolve. It didn't blink. It didn't pop like a bubble. It didn't materialize like an unpopped bubble. It didn't zip off. It just wasn't there. We didn't even gasp because there wasn't anything to gasp to. But we were like, the next response was like, where is it? Do you guys not see it anymore? Like the conversation we had first had of like us confirming that it was there. It was the inverse conversation where it was like us confirming that it's not.
Yeah.
Which is not fun.
Yeah.
And then we start doing the dance, all of us instinctively looking 360 in this sweet vantage point that we're at, and there's just not a cloud in the sky. And so we have that experience.
Well,
and somebody goes, it's getting close to this brief, and we still have 5 minutes to walk, and we still have to go get signed in the skiff, which is, a process. And we're going to be a little bit late now to the meeting, which is like the most important meeting of our careers thus far.
Or perhaps not.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well said.
Born ones in one day.
And so we, I guess, go into that process. And I can speak for myself, but also asking the question to my guys after this hour-long brief that was packed. Did you all like catch anything that was said in the most important brief of our careers? And the answer is no.
They were too distracted thinking about what they just seen.
Didn't have a choice.
Did you guys recollect as a group or perhaps one-on-one with any of the other guys after that?
Not formally. So it's an interesting look into human psychology as well. And I had a peep into that too. A great experience working with ASA, working with reporters and witnesses as well. But everybody had their own different response, right? We became very, very employed, after that brief. So we had a lot to distract us, frankly, which is maybe a good thing. But I still took the time to document the best that I can as an intelligence officer what had occurred, and in a formal way, just with the understanding that, sooner is better than later. And I had a couple of the individuals who wanted to participate in that, I asked everybody personally, like, hey, can you just give me some input into this PowerPoint that I'm making? And I got a couple bits of input, from two of them. And a couple of them, like when I had that question, the next day or two after, gave me the response of, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to ever kind of have that question asked to me again.
Wow, they just shut it right down, huh? Strange. It's strange. I mean, so that's how, I've witnessed it myself, of course. You have too, obviously, but that is, one of the responses that you see sometimes.
Yeah, and it's honestly understandable. The people who kind of had that response were older in tenure. They were more career oriented. They had, crossed that Rubicon to where it's like, okay, I'm doing this for 20. And if I'm doing it for 20, I'm going to go as far as I can. And so I can completely sympathize and empathize with that response, frankly. They're great people too that I respect a lot. I think it was just like, in some ways it's maybe a healthier response.
Yeah, I won't argue that.
I'm going to go back to reality here,
my perceived reality anyway, the consensus one. Okay, well, so what I'm hearing is that you guys just kind of, all right, it happened. We got a few inputs. Some people didn't want to touch it again. Other people provide a little input. What happened? What happened there?
I will say the only other effect is based on our extremely privileged access to information and the line of work that we were in. We had a lot of resources available to where if you're a curious individual who wants to, get a little more information about something they may have perceived, we had resources, so myself and a couple others in that group, after hours, just trying to make sense of what we saw, went down some rabbit holes.
Yeah. Anything fruitful?
At the time, and that was 22, a level of fruitfulness where I was much more reassured about my experience.
In what way?
Much more
reassured.
Reassured that I was very fortunate, frankly. And I also can relate to people who saw shit by themselves or with one other person. If it was just, even with my background and, trust with information and all sorts of, if it was just me or one other person, I might have just completely put it into a recess of my mind because it was so far out there. What can you do with it? It was honestly nice from my perspective to see a level of information, and I think I'll leave it at that, plus being with 4 other very, very vetted people, that I wasn't losing in.
Yeah.
And I never had doubts before, and I don't have doubts after that, but it was reassuring, And I will say, back in 22, there was more reassuring information than, 2023.
Yeah.
Post Grush. Yeah.
You have your PowerPoint deck. You've got your input from the other folks that were there. You guys have done a little digging and research and,
over months.
Yeah. Helped you understand there was a there over a few months. What happens next? Where does that deck go?
Oh, it's a good question. So I guess what happens next, to stay chronological, we are very, very employed doing our job, and in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. That took all priority, frankly, and as like a fighter pilot, the profession kind of demands everything. And so it takes your entire life. And so I lived that, and frankly, that job was about as fascinating as, I don't want more fascinating than that job.
You've reached your limit. Yeah.
I got out because I was like, okay, that might be the limit for me. I got back though for my last deployment, had a exit plan to get out, and had a little bit of a window as where I'm out processing out of the Army, to where I don't really have a job. I've been backfilled. I've trained my backfill. I'm, just a piece of,
Yeah.
I'm just a guy on a piece of paper now in a skiff. And I reach out to you because I can't honestly remember where, actually I heard it from you. And this is kind of like hindsight, so I honestly don't remember like my full motives, but like, I think for about a year after that experience, I had the feeling of like, yes, Cheyenne Mountain has every sensor known to man. Yes, they have cameras everywhere. Yes, they have to be aware that this is going, that this incident occurred, but like I didn't do my diligence in helping them out.
Closing the loop, perhaps. Yeah.
And I think for plenty of valid reasons, like you have the ability to rationalize a lot of things that make sense. And I don't feel bad about it, but like it kind of gnawed at me a little bit. I think that's always a good indicator that there is a loop to close.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't know what to do because I'm working in this extremely privileged space with access to insane information, and I don't know what to do with this. Aside from when I was deployed, the Grush incident occurred, and
Grush incident, the hearing.
Yeah. When I was deployed overseas, and that got the interest of like my task force, So aside from that, and having kind of an example is not the right word, but like maybe it is the right word, like an example of like somebody trying to do the right thing. I didn't know what that is. I honestly still don't know what that is, but I'm trying. I mean, I reached out to you. I heard of a guy named Ryan Graves.
Yeah. And, just to be clear, obviously, about some of the information Caison may have roaming around and noggin there is classified, but as I always like to say, he doesn't want classified information. We don't solicit for it, and I wouldn't ask for it. And of course, Caison didn't provide any to me, but we do have connections at ASA in order to work with organizations and executive branch in order to, through the right channels, get that information through to people that can incorporate into the corpus of what we're trying to understand here. And at the time when you first came forward, the first option for that, the only option at the time, was the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office.
Yeah.
And this isn't intended necessarily to bash the current office, I will say, but at first, that was kind of the door that was open to receive this information, and that's where I recommended you went.
Yeah, and you gave me a nod to if I remember correctly, the Northcom general order. So the commander for Northcom had a GO saying if you had
General order.
Yeah, thank you. If you had like a UAP experience, it's your obligation to report it. If I remember correctly. And he pointed me in that direction. And crazy as it is, for somebody who is looking for shit like that on TS and NSA and SIPR machines, could not find it. Apparently it did exist.
Somehow I had to educate you on the current orders within the DoD. Great.
Yeah, you had to have like a map to find it.
Yeah. So not well distributed at the time, right? Which was one of the problems, right? Because, it's all of a sudden AARO has a reporting process now, but, how well promulgated is that, right? And just because there's been an order issued somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon doesn't necessarily mean that, things are now operating smoothly.
Well said.
And so, so that you went there. Would you like to share anything, about that?
Yeah, you pushed me to AARO. I was eager to be useful, and that was it. I just wanted to be like, hey, I'm as aware of the importance of Cheyenne Mountain as anybody. It was an extreme intrusion into our airspace. If it wasn't us, I assumed it wasn't us, and I think that's a safe assumption. And so I'm just like, hey, I am to finally be helpful,
As per this order.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty general trend in my career, is trying to be helpful. And I reached out to them, provided the PowerPoint that I made, and had a pretty disappointing experience from the start. A uniquely disappointing experience from the start, yeah.
I don't want to necessarily bash AARO too hard, and that's only because at the end of the day, they are still the congressionally mandated office. And for those that perhaps aren't following as closely, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, Caison had an experience that wasn't positive, and we might be able to get into some of the details, but generally, at that early stage in their organization, they just, one, didn't have the resources or capabilities or seemed like the wherewithal to properly conduct an investigation, do it nicely. But recently, it seems under the new leadership of John Kolosky, I have personally had positive interactions with him in his office since he's taken over. And lately, it seems that the new congressional members are now reporting back perhaps amended fences. So don't want to start slugging them in the chest too hard, right? And we're talking maybe about these are early days here. You had a bad experience. Do you want to add any more color to that?
I already talked about it, and there's not a ton to talk about. The first red flag was I've worked with almost every organization there is in the IC and a lot in the DoD and almost all in special operations. And I'd never had a overtly unprofessional experience in even small things like sending an email to someone. But the responses I initially got when I said I had information that I wanted to give to them, even the email was just like terse, typoed. Like it was almost like it had been outsourced to like
someone that didn't know this, like the normal protocols, perhaps.
Not even that, just like overt indifference, like just overtly unprofessional, where that's not how you would start any conversation or engagement or relationship with a organization that you haven't touched with and with somebody you don't know. And I never had that experience. The IC in special operations world is pretty competent. So that was weird. They kind of did nothing with the information, but I was like, hey, I'm getting out. I'm going to business school. I've done my diligence. I was okay, honestly, with them not doing much with the information or responding or like, maybe they have, 50 of these a day. Like it was possible based on some of the things I'd seen. That was kind of that for the moment. Got out of the Army, went to business school, started a completely new life after getting back from a gnarly deployment 2 months later. And did not think about it. I got a LinkedIn message from an individual who said that they were with AARO, who was an engineer, obviously a contractor in the organization, who wanted to have a conversation. Did that in a car in Boston. The person was very cordial, very nice. I had no indicator that there was any malice or misintent. Seemed to be trying their best, but it was also very obvious that they did not have professional experience in doing witness interviews or casing or, knowing how to diligently collect information. And it was a 15-minute conversation on a cell phone. And that was that. Yeah. Like, all right, I did my diligence again for the second time, whatever.
Thank you for your service.
No big deal. And then frankly, an event that I still don't understand kind of happened where a couple months later, no interaction, out of the blue, I get an email on my MIT provided email address, if I remember correctly, from the director, deputy director of AARO, a few officers from Air Force, a few officers from Air Force Special Investigations, a pretty large list of people with something along the line saying, Mr. Best, we think we may have found what you and your peers saw. Is this a picture of what you saw? And it was a aerostat balloon.
Classic balloon strikes again, man.
And you can probably tell I shouldn't have taken it personally, and I don't a lot, but I do a little, because it takes something to, put yourself on a limb to some degree to give information about a UFO incident while you're in the intelligence community. Like that takes some level of courage, I think. And for that to be like the conclusion after frankly a very unimpressive experience, I mean, they sent some sort of message, It was not a PTID or an aerostat.
Yeah. And so, for people who might not be familiar with these are tethered balloons, typically with what look like little wings in the back that kind of keep them stabilized. They look a lot like balloons.
And they are.
Yeah, they are balloons, and they just hang on a thread, and they provide surveillance and things like that on borders.
Yeah, they're very big. I've stood next to them.
Yeah, I've flown past them. I've seen them in the air. I think most people that have done anything operationally military in the Middle East is probably familiar with what they look like.
Yeah, or on the Mexican-American border, they're floating around there too.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're in Key West as well. So anyway, something, just to kind of summarize here, they basically, after what from your assessment was a very low quality investigation, came up with the lowest common denominator thing that they could use to dismiss the case.
That was the most publicly broadcasted internally, like, to the biggest audience with the most important people.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's a good
I had
point.
no experience with.
Yeah. So, this is them, including the witness, in front of their bosses, I guess, right? Or the right people.
People I didn't know, but it was a long list of them. Yeah.
Okay. I keep saying, but what's next, right? I mean, it's a pretty chronological story. It's pretty neat. So, and just because you skipped over a little bit, you're now at MIT's business school. You're in Massachusetts. We actually don't live too far. I'm in New Hampshire. You come and visit once or twice.
Live free or die.
Yes, sir. We are now in Austin, and I intend to get you here as well. But what do we do next?
In this space, I mean,
we said, who else might be interested in this information?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was all you. You should be talking about that.
Well, okay, maybe I'll bring this up. So, without getting into too much detail, because I've spoken about this publicly, there was a small group within the FBI that wanted to investigate UAP, in my opinion, earnestly. The whole bucket of what might UAP be, not necessarily just like a clever way of doing counter UAV. They were truly interested in all aspects of it. And it was a relatively small group. And we knew the cases, some of the cases that we had were impactful to representatives in Congress and different committees. We were hoping for them to be useful at AARO, but at least at this current time, they didn't seem to have the operational capability to do that job very well. And I said, well, the FBI has a lot of experience with these cases. If our witnesses are okay with it, then, perhaps by ingesting this information through there, they can pull the information through the networks that they have available to them, such as FA data, et cetera, that would do all the investigative work that I think people were expecting AARO to do, but weren't necessarily staffed or experienced to do so.
Yeah.
And so we asked our witnesses, and in fact, most of them agreed to have that conversation. And you were one of those people. Do you want to talk about that experience?
Sure. Yeah. So this must have been early of 24 when that conversation was had, because I was getting ready to go to my summer internship in New York City. And I just share that for the context. I start that conversation with the Bureau. They want to start it off with a field interview. We schedule it to be done in New York City, where I'm located, over the summer. Go into the Bureau building, do the interview. It was, you can just tell. Like, I don't know what the intent of it was. I still don't fully know the intent, but at least they were trying, which is a good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just there, frankly, for the exact same reason of I don't see any downside. I'm confident in what we saw. I'm not worried about my reputation in this day and age, frankly, thanks to some people like you. There's no downside. Let's give it a shot. And the experience was certainly better than AARO. Yeah, there weren't any negatives about it. And I didn't know certainly what the intent of it was back then, and I still don't fully know now, but at least they treated you respectfully. And so it was a good experience. I spoke with a forensic artist. She tried her best to paint something that is, I still have a hard time visualizing, and I saw it, so it's not perfect, but better than I could do. That's for damn sure. Yeah. And so that was kind of the start of that experience.
I don't know 100% either exactly what the overall goal, I would say, of the FBI as they see it is, right? But I will say the effect that it's had is that it's provided, a stream of highly investigated and processed information, not just within the FBI, but to Congress, who they have been briefing, both the House and the Senate, as well as working with the White House. And I understand, the leadership of the FBI. Well, let me say this first. That I think, that's the impact that we've had, and that small group has grown, to my understanding, to a larger group that is moving forward in a pretty big way, and I think more to follow on that in the future. But it provided, if you will, a little good old-fashioned interagency competition that I think finally, the truth, at least the data is jostling out in between that a bit, right? And Congress has been receiving that. It's always good to have a little competition. This is America, is it not, right? This is capitalism. You've been a grunt on the ground with a rifle. You've got to see behind the curtain on the intel side. You had fun at college. You've gone to MIT. You've seen a UAP. You've reported to FBI and AARO. Pretty full experience. And eventually, after a lot of this, we asked you to join ASA as a volunteer, and had you leading our report intake process for a while. And I'm sure that's maybe even another whole podcast. But
we could talk for
let's
days.
shift a little bit maybe to that, right? So you had all these experiences, and actually, before we get into that, I just want to put maybe a bow on your case, right? And so again, today is June 13th. Yesterday, the DoD released their third tranche of UAP files, and your case is in there. I believe it was retweeted by the White House. I thought it was interesting. And there's a few files in there, and there's both the AARO report from when you reported to AARO. There's also the FBI report in there from when you reported to the FBI. I would encourage folks to perhaps read both of those and see, how AARO assessed your report and their conclusions perhaps, or what their thoughts were versus the FBI's presentation of the data. So you don't have to really believe anything we're saying. You can kind of go read those right now, because these have now come out the other side, which is, I don't think either of us expected to be in this position here, where the White House was retweeting your UAP experience a few years ago.
Still haven't thought about it.
And the sketch that Caison mentioned is in those files as well, so you could see what they came up with there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they released it too, but I think it's one of my counterparts as well.
Yeah.
Might have some files in there too.
And there's a number of cases from the last tranche, from ASA, and I met actually some are I'm sure you've processed. But either way, you came out of ASA. You want to talk about that experience at all, or any interesting cases, or maybe you've discovered this is all bunk? I don't know. You tell me. What
do you want to talk about? You're opening up a big can of worms. Well, thank you for giving me the leash and to take a shot on me with starting to help out with the witness reporting program.
Better.
You guys had obviously done a lot of groundwork, and I was there to just add on. And as far as this topic goes, and as far as like the digestibility required to absorb the information that we're talking about with non-human intelligence and UAP and hyper advanced technology and all sorts of things that I just so fully understand and sympathize with people who have trouble grasping it.
Or choose to tune it out.
Sorry?
Or just be like, I'll just tune that out because that's too much for me to, There's too many ways that breaks my worldview.
And fair enough. Because I have had 3 kind of spheres of experience to like confirm not fully what's going on, but like well beyond there's something there.
Okay. 3. What are those? I might guess 2,
yeah, but I mean, the fact that we saw a UAP in broad daylight, personally, the exposure I had to certain information while in the position that I was in the military, and then being in this position with ASA, a couple years later. Like, it's pretty cool seeing some very credible individuals provide accounts and things to back it up and have those conversations with whether a pilot or school teacher in Oklahoma. Like this, the thing that makes everybody the same as far as a witness to ASA is that they were looking up at the sky and saw something, whether they're in the sky themselves or on the ground. It was a great experience because, like, even from like a psychological standpoint, you got to just see the full gambit of people and almost solely positive experiences in that position. So we can talk about anything.
What maybe big picture, did you learn from that position or access to that data?
There's a huge category of sightings that get just dismissed because they just don't fit enough of the bill.
They're not weird enough?
No. It's like, I can't confirm this to enough degree, and that degree is so high that if anything doesn't meet that bar, I'm just going to say it didn't happen and completely dismiss it. Like, it's like the neuralizer. Like, I never saw it.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of reports, and a lot of those reports I would not say are high confidence or can be corroborated, or I have high certainty that it occurred, or at least occurred in some fashion. But like, there's that middle ground, and there's a lot of them, and it paints a picture too.
Yeah.
And then when you have that large middle ground, that large pool of data, and then you do have some incredible occurrences that I personally, having done the interviews and taken in the information, have high conviction and have good reason for high conviction, and have been trained on assessing conviction levels for a year, plus the job at a high level. It paints a picture that observations with UAP and likely NHI is not that uncommon. Like every single person, every single witness that I ever interviewed, and it was a lot, like would apologize kind of and be like,
sorry,
I know you can't believe this, but like this occurred, because everyone thinks, because the experience is so extreme and not talked about, that everybody who's had the experience thinks that they must be the only one in the world.
Yep.
And if you're in just like a hyper privileged position as I am, to where I get to speak to these people, come to us, and you get to speak with and interact with them, you get to know that it's just not.
You get to see the full picture in a different way that the individuals can't, because they're all coming to you. And yeah, I mean, I sometimes have lately been almost just reminiscing on that. And sometimes, you know, this is just a heart feel, but like it's probably as high as 30% of people have probably had an experience and are not
people
talking
or
about
aviators.
People in general. Yeah, people in general. You know, especially, you know, as I engage with more people here in Austin and elsewhere, and the temperature, you know, is lowering on this, people are more willing to talk about it. And, you know, it just always shocks me just how many people are willing to.
And it's not the only thing in life that's like that. You know, there's all sorts of things that happen to people that are far more common than they are told to believe, because it doesn't want to be, you don't want to talk about it, or it's so awful or whatever. And, you know, struggles, abnormal experiences, which is frankly kind of like another way to say, just like, instead of, everybody understands the 1 in 10 because everybody's had 1 in 10 experiences. Everybody understands 1 in 100 experiences because everybody's had them. And like, it's in the zeitgeist. When you have a 1 in a million experience, there's still 365 of those every year, right? Like there's 360 million Americans. That still happens, but then you can't take a 1 in a million experience and then talk about it with your friends.
Yeah.
Because it's not in.
Yeah, they don't get it.
You can't. Yeah.
Or they choose not to, right? Because some people, like I said, you know, have had experiences and have chosen to ignore it. And I mean, some of those are witnesses that have come to us and have said, hey, you know, I've only told my wife about this, and it happened 30 years ago. And so they've, you know, they've self-centered themselves, self-nebulized themselves to the information, either because of their own, you know, particular hangups, or perhaps because of the implications socially of how it might be perceived around others. But at least something I've heard a lot interviewing witnesses is that they actually feel like this is a time where this information can actually be useful, and they feel more comfortable coming forward. And one of the reasons they come to us is so that we can make that data actionable.
Yeah. I'm not sorry to cut you off there, but that is just a trend that I saw that was kind of, when I previously said that it was positive, like the experience, I think that's a huge reason why, is like almost like most of the interactions that I had speaking with witnesses is they're just people trying to be helpful.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And like you said, almost doing it against their better nature, right? Having to apologize first for how weird it sounds. But I'll tell you, it often doesn't sound weird to us.
No.
Based on what we heard. All right. Well, what else? What else have you learned from that data?
How detailed do you want to go, I guess?
As deep as you like. And I will, actually, this is a great time to let people know and ask you, Caison. We'd like to provide the opportunity for our members to ask you questions as part of an AMA after this airs. And I'm going to put you on the spot right now and ask you if you'd like to come back remotely to join our members.
Happy to.
For that. Awesome. Yeah, because I bet they'll have a lot of questions. If you'd like to be part of that, we'll do that about a week after this airs. And you can go to safeaerospace.org, sign up to be a member, and you'll be able to join us and ask Caison your questions
I'd love
yourself.
to say hi to probably some previous witnesses as well. Because
oh, that'd be great. Yeah, hopefully we'll have some of them in there as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's hear what else. What else did you learn from that?
Okay, we got the general atmospherics. I think there's very valid observers regardless of their credentials. You know, you're told to use credentials as a validation method, and it is one, but I think it oftentimes is like a huge hang up of people self-censoring and gatekeeping because it doesn't fit. You don't fit the bill. You're not a police officer. You're not a pilot. You're not a West Point grad, whatever. There's still tons of great people who are good at describing what they saw, who don't necessarily have the accreditations that are societally determined to be like useful.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So
For this task specifically. Sure. Yeah. But I'll just add one thing. What unlocks that, I think, for us is the fact that when you do have enough data, right? Because at the beginning, when you're figuring all this out, what are you going to do, right? How else are you going to operate in this environment, right? When you're going in with very little data and a highly complex information environment. And so you lean on those crutches. But once you start collecting enough data, then you can actually pick out the consistencies across cases that are interesting and important and apply that to people you might not, you can then say, okay, I need to find these signals, not necessarily look for people that are the signal, right?
Perfectly said. Yeah. And that's what I'm trying to do with your questions. Like I'm trying to go big in the data set and then like we can go smaller. But you're 100% right. And you don't get there without the high credibility, like perfect cases and things like that too. I think to go one level deeper, you get to a point in your conviction and there's just a lot to be said about being able to see all this data, and it's not pretty and it's not easy to digest, and it requires a trained eye, frankly, to parse together, and it requires hundreds of hours before you even start doing interviews to see the patterns, because it's disparate data.
It is.
Talking about the most fringe thing you can talk about.
Mm-hmm. And describing things we potentially don't really have context or words to describe.
If I can barely describe the object that I saw with my own eyes, then like, God help me, you know? But once you start doing that, what starts getting really interesting is not only when you have those high conviction cases, it's when you start having high conviction cases and medium conviction cases that are describing like the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's like if you're a murderer and the cops start saying, hey, there's somebody who looks like this, and it's generally the same person, like, yeah. And I got to the point in the process to where a few of those just seem very high conviction, that people are describing a object or series of objects, that the confidence that is the case as described, you have multiple flashlights looking at the elephant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. and the same spots of the elephant at the same time. Yeah. And, conviction rises.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Any cases that, to really drill down that, you might consider your favorites, if that's the right even word to use?
There's actually quite a few. I know
it's hard to like.
I was thinking about this on a flight.
I get asked all the time, but it's like, which one? I mean,
I think one that stands out, I'll break it down by like category, I think. As far as professionals on the ground, there's a police officer who has sent, I think, 4 or 5 observations with video and multiple witnesses, each observation for extended periods of time over months while they're on shifts, night shifts as police officers. That's showing the same objects every time. And that's an object that we have seen more than several other times throughout reports. Mm-hmm. And so that gets pretty exciting when you're just like, okay, we have enough information here to where it's like, am I going to convince a skeptic? No, I'm not trying to convince a skeptic. I'm trying to convince myself of what's going on. I'm trying to take in this information and paint a picture for myself. And then the next step is to try to articulate it to others. Mm-hmm. But you start seeing that and you're like, okay, this is a thing. Mm-hmm.
You've probably talked to folks like I have about how their experiences have completely, maybe we can even lose the quantifier of completely, but change their worldview. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that was going to be my first question is, do you, consider yourselves among those people? And 2, do you have any reflections of what it's like to engage in that type of conversation with people?
Yeah, I'll answer the first question.
People that have had those experiences.
Yeah, totally. It definitely gives you a level of empathy and sympathy that you otherwise would not have, like, obviously, right? I was in a position of my life where there's like a cognitive bias for it, where it's like the more you know, the less you think you know, the less you know, the more you think you know. And I was in a spot of like accomplishment, for a poorly used word, and privilege of, I'm a special operations intelligence officer doing the biggest mission there is. Like, I must know what's up.
Yeah. Like, who else, right? Yeah.
I have a lot of privileged information. It's just tied to Russia, but like, I know what's up to a large degree. There's always more to know. But like, I know what's up. And then this happens, and it's just like, apparently people have the ability to shut it out.
Mhm.
And that's taken years to process. And I'm still, but like, I think it was largely a ego reducer for me. Not saying I don't have one, but like for the better.
Yeah.
Of like, you have an instance like that. And I've had enough experiences in my life to know that I don't know what I don't know. You only have a bubble of knowledge and you can't tell what's beyond the bubble. And everybody's like that. And some people's are smaller and some people's are bigger, but it's a bubble nonetheless. And you can't cross that Rubicon until you do. But that experience popped the bubble.
Yeah.
And it's a much more interesting way to live life, being like, I wonder how that works, than being like, I've already got it figured out.
It's a somewhat modern phenomenon, maybe going back originally to the Enlightenment, the separation of the mystical from Newtonian mechanics of how the world works, the clockwork patterns that determine everything that happens. And we very much, especially in Western society, have really focused on, or we identify ourselves with a very rational and materialistic and physical version of the world. Perhaps get these peaks beyond the map a little bit. It can, cause you to rethink a bit about how firm your understanding of the world is. And there's people who have experiences that are very open to mystical experiences or spirituality and other things. And for some, it's almost easier to say, well, that's not, that's just their own belief structures manifesting themselves in some way. But, we all also have, very ardent skeptics and rationalists who have gone through these experiences, and, it has opened up their minds a bit to, the world not being perhaps as small as they thought it was.
For sure. Yeah. And I like to think of it kind of as like, if the scientific method is a tool, and it's a hell of a powerful one, we have semiconductors now. It's a thing.
We made sand think.
Yeah. I've never heard that before. That's a good one. Yeah. But that tool is just that. It's a tool. And that tool turned into like an ideology, and that ideology turned to a religion over the course of a few centuries. I like to think that we're now digesting that into back what it is, which is a tool, and that's it.
Yeah.
And
it's a tool for observing a probably infinitely mysterious universe.
And the universe, maybe it's not infinitely mysterious, maybe it is, but it's damn more interesting and mysterious than what we think it is in 2026. Like, give me a break. We were riding horses and buggies 100 years ago. 100 years is a lifetime and a half on average. Like, we don't know what's going on, and that can be okay.
And that's okay. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay. It's like growing up, right? And no longer being a kid and realizing, wow, there's a big world there and it's scary. And then, you grow up and realize it's okay. That's just part of how
it's scary too.
Yeah.
But,
Well, speaking of scary things, maybe to finish this off, you've been, seeing some of these releases and conversation from the White House, what's going on? Where are we going here? Where do you think this conversation goes from here?
Don't put that on me.
No, it's 100. People always ask me that. It's my pleasure to finally get to ask someone else that question.
I don't know what's going on. I don't have unfortunately, as you can tell, anybody who's gotten to this far in the podcast, I want to understand reality. I have spent my career in some ways doing that. I think I'm still doing that. I would love to be in a position of having more impact in this space, having more privileged information as to what's going on. I don't. I am in the private sector now. It's all gone. Like, the ability to peer behind the curtain is a ring of power that is truly addictive, and many people get addicted to it, and I miss it like hell. So I don't know what's going on. I only have speculation. As far as my stuff goes, like, we've painted out what happened. It's obviously useful to somebody, or else nobody would have ever heard about it. In what ways are it's useful? I hope to God that it's for the betterment. I am also a national security guy. You don't do the things that I did because you don't believe in, the ideals of the system and what we should aspire to, and make the sacrifices to do what I previously did otherwise. And so I hope that, it's all under control, and it's all for the better. And I can also recognize, that I have some secrets tied to my unnormal job that are negative. National security is a word that hides a lot of just overtly evil and detrimental secrets. And at the same time, unearthing those detrimental secrets, maybe the best thing to do is just stop lying as opposed to tell the truth about everything. And I don't know if this is that. People talk disclosure. I don't think much about it. I don't aspire to have the government dictate much in my life. Especially
it's a good way of, that's a great statement.
Having been in it my entire adult life until now, let alone thought, which they spend a ton of money and effort and very smart people doing exactly just that. I say all of that to just say, I don't know, but it's useful to somebody. And I just hope it's for good, frankly. Yeah. And I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it was.
Yeah. Thank you for being a great witness for American Safe Aerospace. Thanks for stepping forward. There's two flavors of leadership in the military, right? There's the leadership that, everyone expects you to perform, right? As, a leader in an office space, right? And then there's people that actually go out there and make changes to improve the system, right? You need to be a leader inside the system or outside. And often the ones outside the system are the ones that actually fix the system, right? So thank you for, being a leader inside and outside on this topic.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you, Ryan.
There's so much more we could talk to you about, I'm sure. And I'm sure our members are going to have a lot of great questions, but I think we'll end it there now. We'll see you in about a week for those questions. And if you'd like to join Caison and ask some questions, go to safeaerospace.org, join up to be a member, and you can help support us both in our mission by liking and subscribing to this channel so we can continue to produce awesome content and bring people like Caison out to share their story. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Caison.